there's a kind of collapse that doesn't look like a collapse. It doesn't come with shouting. It doesn't come with drama. It doesn't come with visible chaos. It comes as silence, as an internal shutdown, as the day a sensitive person simply stops. Not because they became cold, but because they felt too much, for too long, alone. And when that happens, the world calls it a personality change, coldness, an inflated ego, but Jung would call it something else. He would call it a rupture of the persona. If you've ever felt that as you became more conscious, you started losing your place. This video isn't here to fix you. It's here to show you what really happens when empathy doesn't meet boundaries, and why this silent collapse might be the beginning of your individuation. There's a quiet, almost invisible moment when a sensitive person stops feeling, not because they became cold, but because they felt too much, for too long, alone. That moment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with shouting or explosions. It settles in like an internal unplugging, as if something old, patient, finally said, enough. The world usually calls that moment a breakdown, a collapse, an unexplainable personality shift. But internally, it's something else. It's the day the empath stops sacrificing themselves to keep the peace. The day exhausted awareness breaks its own persona. The day the shadow, the one pushed down for years by being good, finally rises. And when that happens, it doesn't feel like light. It feels like darkness, not because it's evil, but because it was never seen. There's a dangerous fantasy around empathy, the idea that feeling deeply is always a virtue, that understanding others is always evolution, that swallowing your emotions in the name of harmony is spiritual maturity. But there's a hidden cost to all of it, a cost that isn't charged immediately. It accumulates. The empath learns early that they're strong for enduring. They learn they're evolved for understanding even the people who hurt them. They learn they're spiritual for staying quiet when something hurts. And without realizing it, they build an entire identity around containment. A beautiful persona, kind, reliable, warm, safe, but behind it, something begins to rot in silence. Because every time a boundary isn't set, something inside is betrayed. And inner betrayals don't disappear, they transform. At first, they become exhaustion, then a vague irritation, then cynicism disguised as lucidity, then emptiness. Until one day, something happens. Sometimes it's small, a sideways comment, an unfair demand, a harmless disrespect, and what looks disproportionate to everyone else is actually proportional to everything that was never said. That's where the myth of the empath who went crazy is born. But it wasn't madness. It was accumulated repression finding an abrupt exit. For years, depth psychology has watched this pattern emerge again and again. Highly sensitive, conscious, ethical people who suddenly become hard, cutting, almost unrecognizable, not because they changed, but because they stopped holding up an impossible mask. What scares people isn't the rupture itself, it's the contrast. The one who always gave in now cuts. The one who always understood no longer explains. The one who always stayed now leaves without looking back. And everyone asks, what happened to you? But the real question is, why didn't anyone notice sooner? Because the empath doesn't explode early. They endure to the edge of what's endurable and beyond. They believe that if they keep understanding, something will resolve. That if they keep being bigger, the other person will mature. That if they keep quiet, life will reward them. That belief doesn't come from ego. It comes from a soul that confuses love with self-abandonment. And here's the most disturbing part of this dynamic. The more conscious someone is, the easier it is to lose themselves trying to be right. Consciousness without boundaries becomes refined self-annihilation. There's a psychic part that watches all of this in silence. It doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It simply records. Every time you shrink yourself, so you won't inconvenience anyone. Every time you feel anger but rename it understanding. Every time you notice subtle abuse and spiritualize it, that part grows. And it grows in the dark. It's what many call the shadow. Not in a moral sense, but in an energetic sense. Everything that was denied conscious space. The problem isn't having a shadow. The problem is pretending you don't. Because what isn't integrated shows up brutally. The day an empath snaps isn't an accident. It's a late correction. And what's most frightening, when that correction happens, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't come as a mature conversation. It comes as a final decision. It doesn't come as an attempt at dialogue. It comes as cold distance. It doesn't come as drama. It comes as absolute silence. That's why so many people describe that moment as a loss of soul. But paradoxically, it's when the soul returns to itself. It just returns without softness, because it was ignored for too long. This is the story that almost never gets told, not because it's rare, but because it confronts a comforting idea that being good, sensitive, and empathic is always safe. It isn't. Without individuation, empathy becomes a prison. Without limits, spirituality becomes anesthesia. Without inner confrontation, consciousness becomes an elegant escape. And the day that breaks, everything changes. In the next part, we're going to enter the psychological core of this silent collapse. How the empath's persona is built, why society praises it so much, and why that's exactly what makes it so dangerous once it starts to crack. Before any rupture, there's a silent pact. It's never spoken out loud, but it's felt. Sooner or later, the empath learns there's something in them that calms others. Their presence organizes someone else's chaos. Their listening dissolves tensions. Their understanding softens conflicts they didn't create. And the world responds with approval. You're so mature. You understand everything. With you, it's different. You're strong. These sound like compliments, but psychologically, they function like contracts. Because without realizing it, the empath begins to exist less as an individual and more as an emotional function. They become the place where others unload, the shock absorber, the emotional translator, the adult in the room, even when they're exhausted. That's how the persona forms, not as a conscious lie, but as refined adaptation. The empath's persona is built on 3 invisible pillars. The first is hyperperception. They feel what's coming before it's said. They catch shifts in mood, micro-tensions, loaded silences. That makes them valuable and vulnerable. The second pillar is displaced emotional responsibility. They begin to believe that if something is heavy, it's their job to lighten it. If there's conflict, it's their duty to understand both sides. If someone acts badly, there must be a deeper reason. The third pillar is the most dangerous, the moralization of their own self-suppression. The empath doesn't just stay quiet. They convince themselves that staying quiet is virtue, and a subtle distortion happens. Suffering stops being a signal and becomes a symbol of inner superiority. I feel more because I'm more conscious. I understand because I've evolved. I endure because I'm strong. But the body doesn't agree with that narrative. The body records everything as a loss of territory. Every boundary not set is an internal border violated. Every swallowed emotion is diverted energy. Every forced silence is a piece of identity pushed underground. And still, the empath keeps going, because abandoning the persona feels more terrifying than abandoning themselves. There's a deep fear beneath it. The fear that without this function, there won't be love left. The empath fears that if they stop holding everything up, they'll be seen as selfish, cold, not who they used to be. But who they used to be was never fully intact. It was a survival character. Society rewards that character. Families lean on it. Relationships rest against it. Toxic environments thrive around it. And no one asks how the empath is doing, because they never complain. That's the perfect trap. The one who feels the most is noticed the least. Over time, something strange begins to happen. The empath starts feeling irritated by small things. Not explosive rage, but a constant, corrosive wear. They catch themselves judging the people they used to understand. They feel like pulling away without being able to explain why. They lose enthusiasm for bonds that once felt like destiny. And then guilt shows up, because the persona doesn't allow anger, doesn't allow frustration, doesn't allow hardness. The persona demands permanent moral coherence. So the empath does what they've always done. They repress a little more. But repression doesn't eliminate content. It only relocates it deeper. That's when the shadow begins to organize, not as explicit hatred, but as compressed energy. Everything the empath was never allowed to be starts accumulating in the unconscious. Healthy selfishness, protective aggression, selective indifference, strategic coldness. These qualities aren't negative in themselves. They're necessary psychic functions. But when they're denied for too long, they grow deformed. Without integration, aggression becomes cruelty. A boundary becomes a final cut. Autonomy becomes radical isolation. and the empath doesn't see it happening because they're too busy being good. The problem isn't empathy, it's the absence of individuation. When identity is built only in relation to others, the inner self begins to disappear, and what disappears from consciousness returns as rupture. That's why when the collapse comes, it doesn't arrive as a request for change. It arrives as a total rejection of the past. The person doesn't try to adjust the dynamic. They abandon it. They don't explain. They don't negotiate. They don't teach. They simply withdraw, emotionally, physically, existentially. And the people watching from the outside feel fear, because the empath, finally disconnected from the persona, no longer offers access. In the next part, we'll cross the most uncomfortable moment of this journey, the exact instant the shadow takes the wheel, why it can look inhuman, and why, paradoxically, it's a movement of psychic restoration. There's a specific instant when the inner scale breaks. It isn't gradual, it isn't negotiable, it's final. Up until that point, the empath is still trying to reconcile, still looking for explanations, still wondering if they're overreacting. But there comes a moment when something inside stops asking. It's as if a silent, ancient, watchful part finally says, "I've understood enough." That is the day the shadow crosses the threshold into consciousness, not as a hysterical explosion, not as a visible breakdown, but as cold clarity. What makes that moment so disturbing for people on the outside is the absence of visible emotion. No crying, no guilt, no doubt. The person who always explained doesn't explain anymore. The one who always held doesn't hold. The one who always stayed leaves, and they leave without drama. To those who lived with the empath for years, it looks like cruelty, but internally, it's late survival. The shadow doesn't rise to punish the world. It rises to protect what's left of the self. And here's what few people can accept. The shadow isn't gentle. It doesn't negotiate with people who've crossed invisible boundaries dozens of times. It doesn't care about being understood. It cares about ending the violation. That's why behavior shifts so radically. The empath who snaps isn't trying to teach a lesson. They're interrupting a dynamic, and deep interruptions are rarely soft. For a long time, the empath believed they needed to be understood in order to exist. The shadow discovers they don't. It realizes existence doesn't depend on validation, but on inner integrity, and that realization changes everything. From that point on, the person may look cold, distant, even indifferent, but that coldness isn't a lack of feeling. It's the absence of self-abandonment. It's the quiet of someone who no longer needs to explain themselves. What scares people isn't the hardness, it's the sovereignty. Because an integrated empath stops being predictable. They don't react the way they used to. They don't absorb other people's emotional impact. They don't bend to maintain an image. And that breaks invisible contracts. People who leaned on them emotionally feel betrayed. Environments that depended on their tolerance start collapsing. Relationships built on one-sided understanding go empty. And everyone asks, where did that person go? They didn't go anywhere. They arrived. They just arrived late, tired, and with no desire to negotiate their existence. There's a dangerous phase after this rupture, a phase where the shadow can dominate completely. In that phase, the person may feel pleasure in cutting, in isolating, in denying any form of vulnerability. This happens because for too long, vulnerability meant exploitation. So the psyche does what it's best at. It swings to extremes. If there was too much openness before, now there's absolute closure. That is the price of prolonged repression. Integration doesn't start balanced. It starts rough. That's why many people going through this process believe they lost themselves, that they became someone they don't recognize, that something essential died. But what died was the unlivable persona. The problem isn't the presence of the shadow. The problem is staying there. The shadow isn't the destination. It's the bridge. A bridge between naive empathy and integrated maturity, between feeling everything and choosing what to carry, between understanding others and not betraying yourself. Without that crossing, the empath stays spiritually infantilized, good but fragmented, sensitive but too vulnerable, conscious but without an axis. The snap isn't the end of the road, it's the point of no return. After it, you can't go back to who you were, but for the first time, you can become whole. In the final part, we'll talk about what almost no one teaches, how this collapse can turn into individuation, how to integrate empathy and boundaries without losing your soul, and why after the day the empath snaps, life can never be small again. After the day the empath snaps, there's no return to innocence. Sensitivity stays, perception stays sharp, empathy doesn't disappear, but it stops being automatic, and that changes everything. The person who has crossed this collapse doesn't feel less. They feel with choice. They don't understand less. They discern. They don't close out of fear. They set boundaries out of inner respect. This is the point where consciousness stops being an ideal and becomes structure. Because empathy without structure is leakage, and whatever leaks, drains. What begins to emerge after the snap isn't hardness, it's axis. An inner axis that no longer depends on approval or imagined reciprocity, or the hope that the other person will one day understand. The person finally understands. It's not their job to be a bridge for someone who won't cross. That understanding doesn't arrive as soft enlightenment. It arrives as quiet maturity. And something rare happens here. Empathy returns, but now it's threaded with boundaries. It doesn't offer itself indiscriminately. It responds to real presence. It doesn't anticipate. It doesn't sacrifice. It doesn't prove itself. And the world responds in an ambiguous way. Some people leave because they only knew how to relate to the old version of you. Others try to trigger guilt. They call clarity coldness. They call self-respect selfishness. They call individuation a negative change. But some people recognize it. They feel safer. They sense there is someone whole there, because integrity is perceptible. An integrated empath doesn't need to explain themselves. Their presence doesn't beg, drain, or plead for connection. It simply exists. And fully existing is deeply uncomfortable for people who are used to invading. That's why this process is so frightening. It isn't romantic. It isn't pretty. It isn't Instagram friendly. It involves loss, grief for the old identity, temporary loneliness, a complete reconfiguration of how you relate. But it returns something essential: ownership of yourself. You stop living in service of being good and start living in service of being true. And inner truth always has an external price. After the snap, the empath understands something that once seemed impossible. Not everyone deserves access to your depth, and that doesn't make you smaller. It makes you precise. Sensitivity stops being an open field and becomes living territory with clear borders. That is individuation, not as a concept, but as an experience. You stop confusing yourself with the persona and start holding your complexity, light and shadow, empathy and firmness, care and refusal. And when that happens, something curious appears. Peace doesn't come from external harmony, but from internal coherence. You no longer need to be understood. It's enough to be whole. The world may react. It may resist. It may try to pull you back. But after the day the empath snaps, there is something that can't be undone. The awareness that your soul is not negotiable. And that awareness, quiet and firm, is the true point of no return. Maybe what hurt the most in all of this wasn't the rupture. It was realizing you spent too long trying to be understood, when what you actually needed was to be whole. The day the empath snaps isn't the day the soul is lost. It's the day it stops being negotiable. Sensitivity remains. Empathy remains. But now they move with borders, with axis, with choice. And maybe the world will find this version of you strange. Maybe it will try to pull you back. Maybe it will call coherence coldness. But if you made it this far, you probably already know. You can't unsee what you've seen. Integrated consciousness doesn't ask permission to exist. If this video put words to something you felt but never knew how to explain, then this space is for you. Here, empathy isn't a prison. Consciousness isn't a burden. And depth doesn't have to be lonely. If it resonates, stay. Because the next videos aren't about waking up. They're about learning how to live awake without losing yourself in the process.